This podcast is produced by The Brand is Female.
Always was, always will be. Aboriginal land. Always was, always will be. Aboriginal land. Always was.
Tanse, hello. My name is Shayla Stonechild, and welcome to the Matriarch Movement podcast. I'm speaking to you from the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. Every week on the show, I share stories of Indigenous women from Turtle Island and beyond to challenge the mainstream narrative around Indigenous identity and offer up a new category of role models so that the next generations may thrive. We'll put a spotlight on issues facing Indigenous women and explore how we can reclaim our voice, our body, and our spirit and our power that have been silenced and stolen throughout history and humanity. If you like this podcast, don't forget to subscribe on the platform of your choice. Now, let's get to this week's conversation. I'm your host, Shayla Stonechild, and I'm super excited to be here with Megan. Megan is a Métis educator who grew up in Edmonton, which is on Treaty 6 territory in the Métis homeland. Growing up, she experienced the harmful and pervasive misconceptions about Indigenous peoples in the colonial lands known as Canada. This fueled her desire to become a teacher and motivated her desire to advocate for fundamental changes in education. She is currently a high school English teacher committed to disrupting dominant narratives and celebrating and affirming her students' identities in her classroom. Her commitment to anti-oppression work has allowed her to lead professional development sessions for other educators. In recent years, she's moved beyond her classroom and started to use social media as a tool to share information and educate people on Indigenous issues. In her spare time, she enjoys coaching basketball and creating artwork. So welcome to the podcast, Megan Tipler.
Thanks for having me.
I'm curious to know, first question, where did you grow up?
So I grew up in Edmonton. My family roots go back to like the Cree Métis community of Lac St. Anne. Mm-hmm. And my grandma grew up in Marlborough, which is it used to be a Métis settlement, but it's not anymore. But yeah, my mom kind of was all over the place in her childhood. And then mostly in Edmonton. And so then that's where she kind of settled and met my dad, and that's where my sisters and I grew up. So we are Edmonton kids.
And you're back in Edmonton, right?
Yeah.
And so what was it like growing up as a Métis person? Because for me, I actually didn't really claim my Métis roots because I felt quote unquote like less native. So I'm curious to know how was that experience for you growing up Métis?
I think that growing up, I went to schools that were predominantly white. Mm-hmm. Maybe have one or two other kids that were Indigenous, and I think I got stereotyped into that role. I remember the people coming in to talk about the elementary education talks about Indigenous peoples of the past a lot. So you'd get once a year they'd come in and they'd be like, oh, let's do a smudge, or let's feel a beaver pelts or something. And it's do you want to come up to the front since you're the native kid in class? And I was like, so I think that I've said this before that it was embarrassing at times because you get spotlighted as that kid, right? And then you tend to withdraw a little bit from it. So I think probably wasn't until I was in university that I really embraced my identity. We grew up, we were native, but it wasn't something that that we were, I should say, speak for myself, not for my sisters, but something that I took pride in probably until I was in university. And I was kind of challenging my own notions of what it meant to be Indigenous.
Mm-hmm. I think I can relate to that because I grew up in a predominantly white city community as well, Medicine Hat. And so I didn't realize till I was older how I internalized a lot of my shame and shyness because I felt different. And I also felt I didn't want to speak too much because I could become that quote unquote token native. Is that
and Alberta's a special kind of frustration.
I know. Yeah. I live in BC now, but yeah, every time I go back to Alberta, I always forget like how more progressive, I guess, Vancouver is in their thinking. And then I go back to Alberta and I'm like, oh yeah, this exists like outside of BC still. And so my next question, I know you do a lot of work within the school system. How did that come to be? You went to university to study what first?
So I just took secondary education. So my degree is in physical education and English.
Mm-hmm.
And then just going into teaching like English language arts, there's just a very obvious need for representation. There's a lack of authors that are centered that aren't, white male stale.
Mm-hmm.
And so that just became a focus for me, was trying to find literature that affirmed the identity of my students and
Mm-hmm.
of myself, and brought in those different perspectives that they weren't being exposed to. I know you've talked a lot about representation too, in the work that you and like I don't think representation is the solution to all our problems,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
I also think like you and I talking about our experience as Indigenous students, and like having a lack of representation or feeling like the tokenized student, and bringing in more representative text and a multiplicity of text really like pushes kids to consider an experience outside their own.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, I think like representation is just like the little sliver and it goes a lot deeper. Like representation is only good for so much until we need like more action and more like inclusivity, I guess you could say. So I know you said growing up you felt it wasn't until like university when you started to reclaim more of your Métis roots. In university, did you also kind of face the same thing? Because I feel like for me, I've had a lot of resistance going into a colonial institution because for once, I feel like at the core of a lot of education is like white supremacy and it is a lot of colonial professors. And so I've always just been, kind of scared and intimidated to get into post-secondary education. And so I'm curious to know more about your experience as being a Métis person in university, and also like any advice for people that are maybe, contemplating post-secondary because of this.
I definitely think like, yeah, there was frustrations in university where, especially like you're trying to debate your humanity to someone, like, right, someone's talking about it as a concept instead of like your lived experience. I do think like now for education, like all teachers have to do, I think it's EDU 211, which is like Indigenous perspectives in education.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the professors at the U of A, Dr. Farah Sharif, she actually, like, I've been a guest speaker in her class a couple times in that class, which is really nice to just like connect with future educators who are invested in prioritizing Indigenous voices as they become, leaders in their classrooms. But for like Indigenous students in university in general, like I think community is very important, and finding people with like shared values, because operating within a colonial institution can be very frustrating. Even for me trying to go back into school, like I'm trying to do my master's, and for a long time I was like, I don't know if I want to go back to school. Like, is it worth it for me to really go back into an institution and put myself in that situation again? And I don't know, I struggle with that a lot. And even like as a teacher in the education system, I feel like a walking paradox sometimes, in that like I am advocating for, huge changes, but at the same time I'm a cog in the machine that exists. Like I'm part of the problem. So how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, I think that's what a lot of people don't understand too, is like what I've experienced within working, even in the wellness industry, when I work with other brands, I like want all these big changes. But then I realize like these institutions and businesses have been operating from this place for a very long time. So the changes that I want to see are not going to happen like overnight. So why did you get into education? Like when you're feeling burnt out and, overwhelmed and lethargic, what is your why that gets you to, go back and keep doing the work that you're doing?
I joke about that to my husband all the time, that every time I'm feeling like I just want to give up or like I'm so frustrated by something, a student will, like a former student will message me or text me and be like, hey, I saw this on your Instagram, or like, I just wanted to tell you, like, I really appreciate you, or you know, like one of my first classes that I had when I moved back to Edmonton, I had a student message me and she sent me this huge long message about how she was so excited because she was in first year of university in gender studies and she was getting to study all these different authors. And like, I was one of the only teachers in her K-12 education that prioritized different voices. And I hate using that term different, but you know, outside of what we've internalized as the norm. And so her message just came at a time when I was just like so frustrated by so many things. And I was like, oh man, that was like, I needed that. So for sure, youth, I think, are the motivating factor at all times because they are our future.
And what has your response been from like, so first off, what are the age groups that you teach right now?
So right now I teach 9th and 10th grade.
9th and 10th grade. And what is their response when you do bring in, you know, like Indigenous authors and different voices? How has that response been?
I honestly don't think they think twice about it.
It's
like, and that's the thing is like there's so much, the resistance to me comes from teachers. It doesn't come from students. And so like when I have these conversations like with kids, like they don't second guess it for the most part. If they do, they're asking in a very earnest way. So like sometimes when I get frustrated on like Instagram and stuff, I'm like, hey, how would I approach this with a student? Because they're coming from a place of like wanting to know, and it's whereas like adults sometimes I'm like they're so set in their ways that adults are the issue. But yeah, like I said, we did a bunch of texts that are like our core texts this year that were like Indigenous like and characters and stuff, and they didn't think anything of it. Right now their current debate is whether Jared could take Frenchie from the Marrow Thieves. Like they're trying to decide to be the ultimate like but you know, not they're never like, oh, we have to do another Indigenous author, like,
right.
You know.
And so there is a lot of talk about like, you know, indigenizing the curriculum or, you know, decolonizing it. And I know social media moves very fast, but when it's actually working within the institution, like how is that reflected at all? Or like how do you decolonize a curriculum? Like, is that even possible?
I struggle with that question all the time. Like, I don't know if it's really truly possible to decolonize education because education is a colonial institution. Like the way, you know, the way the school system operates right now is built on the bones of like the residential school system, and they're still dealing with like the impacts of that and how our Indigenous students move and operate, or our Black students or our students of color. So like, I don't know if it's truly possible to decolonize the educational system, but I do think you can decolonize like elements of the system. And that indigenization part is kind of like what I focus on, is just really bringing in like Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous knowledge and like having those at the forefront of what I'm doing in my class so that it becomes normal to my students.
And I know you said like you're met with usually a lot of resistance from the teachers. And so if there's any teachers that are listening, you know, what would your advice be to support this reality of indigenizing, you know, parts of the curriculum?
Seek out the knowledge from Indigenous educators. I think sometimes, and I'm just gonna add like an asterisk to that. I've been really lucky because I have worked with people for the most part who have been like, yeah, you have this idea, like go for it in your classroom, or they're like, how do I do that in my classroom? But the teaching profession as a whole, like there's still a lot of issues. And I don't know why it's social media that I tend to see that on the most. Like there's like Alberta teachers Facebook group and stuff, and sometimes like the resistance that I see to change is very frustrating. So I think number one, like, you know, acknowledge your positionality, privilege, and number two, you know, open your mind and open your heart to Indigenous perspectives being at the forefront, and look for Indigenous educators who are already doing the work, because I find a lot of times people are like, it's new to me, so therefore it's
Mhm.
new to everyone. And it's like, no, these things have been discussed and dissected and, debated for
Mhm.
decades. This isn't a new idea.
Has the curriculum changed since, like, when you went to school? Because I know when I went to school, like, I probably read, like, 3 pages of Indigenous people and studies, and, like, I had no history on residential school, and I actually was it true that someone tried to get rid of teaching residential schools, the history within the Alberta curriculum, or am I just making this up?
No, so there the program of studies is it would have been this like the program of studies that I teach is the same program of studies that we probably would have had when we were students. It hasn't changed in like
Okay.
20 years. Um, with ELA, there's a lot of flexibility. So like I'm lucky there that when
Mm.
like English class, like I can swap out texts and still meet the program of studies. But right now, this UCP government is trying to create a new curriculum, and some of the advisors that they have are very anti-Indigenous or debated the appropriateness of teaching residential schools or that like it's like, oh, it's we have to protect the children, and it's like,
Yeah.
you were kidnapping Indigenous children and forcing them into these schools at the same age that you're saying that's too sensitive to talk to kids about. And kids have the ability to have these conversations at a very young age. Like you're not going to talk, present it to them in an age appropriate way, but they can empathize and they can relate and understand, like I said, better than adults sometimes.
Mhm.
So yeah, I'm very worried about what like Jason Kenney and co are concocting at the moment because based on what his priorities have shown, I don't have high hopes, but
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, that's interesting that you bring up, like, the fact that you are questioning whether or not younger kids can learn about residential schools, but then here, we like, kids got taken away at 5 years old, so it's like, right there is just, like, I guess, racism that exists within Canada, and that brings me to my next question is, I my mom's Métis and my dad is Cree. And when I posted online recently that, I was Métis, which I thought, a lot of people knew, but then all of a sudden some didn't. And then I got a lot of lateral violence online, and it was kind of surprising to me. I didn't realize that there was a lot of I guess lateral violence towards Métis people. And so I'm curious to know, have you experienced this as well, being a Métis person? And if you have, like, I don't know, I guess what would your advice be? Because I also realize there's a younger generation of Métis people that may experience this as well.
I think that how would I phrase that? I think it goes both ways. Like Métis have a responsibility to not speak beyond their realm of lived experience because sometimes I find that especially because like there are a lot of people who are finding out their Métis later in life, using their newfound like indigeneity to take opportunities away from people who can maybe serve better in the roles that they're taking on. Still in like the infancy stages of understanding their own identity. Um, so I think that makes it difficult. I also
Mhm.
think I've seen a lot of white presenting Métis who um, kind of excuse the racism that is experienced by um, like our darker skinned kin, right? Like,
Mhm.
oh, well, I've never experienced that, so it doesn't happen. So I think
Right.
specifically for lighter skin Métis, because not all Métis are light skin. That's
Mhm.
misconception.
Yeah.
But for lighter skin Métis, like we have a responsibility to like dismantle, colorism and anti-black
Mhm.
within our communities as well. So I haven't really experienced lateral violence because I do try to be very cognizant of not speaking beyond my my depth, I guess. And if I do, it's usually coming from like an academic or educational standpoint. It's not coming from like, oh, I'm speaking over or speaking for someone. I do understand the lateral violence, and I do understand like I would not dismiss somebody's indigenous identity because of how light or dark they are. But I think specifically as white passing Métis, there is like a responsibility to acknowledge that proximity to whiteness has awarded us um, privileges that other Indigenous peoples may not have.
Yeah, I think that's a good way, a good thing to amplify too is like, I realize, I'm not privileged in the sense of like white privilege, but I'm privileged in the sense of, I'm able-bodied,
Mhm.
I'm lighter skinned native as well, all these other intersections that do give us privilege. And I guess that, yeah, that goes to I think I already asked you, but like for the younger generation that maybe experience lateral violence, what do you think, they should do? Or would you have any advice for the younger generation?
I think seeking connection to your community is the best thing you can do. Um, because you should be like who are you accountable to? Essentially, is the question, right? Like if you're claiming indigeneity to be for your own selfish desires, then it's not coming from a good place. So I think connecting yourself, rooting yourself, being humble, um, is what I would probably do. Like, there are a lot of people too. Like, I've never really received pushback for seeking connection or community. I think sometimes we're so rooted in our own shame that we just like perceive the worst scenario to happen. But even teaching in Gift Lake, like it's a Métis settlement in Alberta. Almost all of the teachers there are Métis. Most of them grew up like predominantly speak Cree there. Among the teaching staff, anyways. And so I'm coming in as like a lighter skinned Métis who doesn't speak the language, and I was welcomed with open arms. And I had like reservations about, they're gonna think I'm this, and I grew up in the city, and blah blah blah. And that was never the experience I had.
Yeah, I think it comes back to, yeah, community and kinship. And I guess during this time, it could feel pretty isolating too, because we're in the pandemic. And I know challenges you face with like resistance from teachers. I'm curious to know, like, how has this pandemic actually affected your work this last year as a teacher?
Um, you know what? The frustration with the pandemic is that I think that in some ways it's been used as an excuse in the education field. Like, we can't advance with anti-oppression or anti-racism because our focus is on the pandemic. And I do understand that. I live that every single day with, teaching students online at the same time I'm teaching students in class, and it's really difficult, and it can be frustrating, and you feel like you're expending all this emotional energy and all that. And I totally understand that and sympathize with that. But at the same time, like, it's not an excuse. Like, we still better for our students every um so yeah, I think the dismissiveness, I think, has been the greatest frustration with the pandemic, is that it's further pushed the work back. So even though we saw in June, like, this huge uprising because of everything that's happening in the US with George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, and people really kind of becoming more conscious in that moment of racial injustice, stuff like that, there wasn't a lot of carryover. Like, as soon as September hit and we were back in school, it was like survival instincts with technology and all, and that kind of like went to the back burner again. And I think that's really frustrating. Um,
Yeah, I feel that like online. Like I was not excited, but I was like when everything was happening on social media, I was finally people are like waking up, and they're waking up to the realities that we face every single day, being a BIPOC person, being an Indigenous person. And then it died down, and then just now with like the attack that just went in Atlanta, where it killed 8 people, and for it to spike up again, I'm like, hey, is it now becoming like a trend for people to speak up about racism when people are getting killed? Like, how many people still have to die for people to continue to wake up? And so some of it can feel performative online. And so engaging in a social media setting, what do you I guess, what is your intention with social media, and how do you engage with your audience on social media?
I struggle with this all the time because I actually hate social media. I'm like a fairly private person. My husband even more so, like he doesn't have social media.
Mhm.
I don't like posting like pictures and videos of myself and things like that. I took a big step back from social media probably in November, just because of a lot of what you were saying. Like a lot of what was being posted was very like performative and reactive instead of um, people interacting in a way that was meaningful and to give up power. It was just like, oh,
Mhm.
I'm repost this person to show that I follow an Indigenous person, and I'm like, I don't want to be anyone's token native. Like,
Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah.
So I struggle with that on social media.
Mhm.
I think that a lot of what I post generally comes from what I'm experiencing and the conversations I'm having in my classroom. Sometimes a kid will ask a question, I'm like, oh, that's like a good, like, that's a good post. Or like, we'll just have a conversation with something. Even kids sometimes will be like, you should post about that. Or like, they're like, oh, your followers went down or your followers went up. You guys are creepy, like, stop. Um, but yeah, so I think the educational piece for me is still important, but also I'm trying, like, anti-racism shouldn't be in easy digestible chunks. And
Mm.
so I feel sometimes that like social media is like people's primary news source and they use that as like,
Yeah.
well, I like this post or I shared this post in my stories and like that's enough. And it's like, well, that's the bare minimum. Like, what are you doing beyond that?
Yeah, like, what is your actions, like, daily? Like, what are you having these conversations outside of social media, or is it just, like, online? For me, I go through a lot of burnout with social media because I feel like there is a lot of pressure when you are an Indigenous educator, because a lot of people, I don't know, they almost, like, rely on you to keep giving out these sources and keep educating them. And so have you also experienced this, like, in your DMs, and have you created boundaries with that?
Yeah, and I don't know if you've had this experience too, where like, there's something happening in the Indigenous community, and you'll get like 5 or 6 messages from people being like, "Are you going to post about this?" And I'm like, I don't have the mental capacity right now. Like, I'm not posting anything.
Mhm.
That doesn't mean I don't support what's going on or that I haven't seen it, but I don't need to see it 6 times in my DMs from people. Like, so that's kind of sometimes my boundary is um, like, thanks for sending that to me, but
Mhm. Yeah, I'm just, yeah, curious to know other people's boundaries because it's hard, when you have not only Indigenous, but non-Indigenous people always coming into your DMs. I'm like, I can barely respond to my emails, let alone, like, all these other messages. So then moving forward, what do you hope to see? There's this, concept of Indigenous futurism, and what does that mean to you?
I really liked the way that Sierra put it. So first of all,
Mhm.
her acknowledgement of like Afrofuturisms as the root source of that, but um she was talking about Black Panther, an imagination of what Black community is capable of without the interference of colonization. And so I think about that for Indigenous communities too. Like, we've been so rooted in um, survival or like resiliency that how do we think about um, the future without any the future without any bars or any like what's the word I'm trying to think of, like,
Barriers?
yeah, without any barriers or without any like internalized like stopping points, like the
Mhm.
limitation is our minds, and I think that that can be a real struggle when from a young age you're receiving these messages of inferiority and you don't think that that there are no limitations because you've had society place so many on you. So like Indigenous futurisms, I just think of looking forward and um, that 7 generations mindset and a good ancestor and investing into youth and thinking of the future and how we can exist without any societal inhibitions, like what does that look
Yeah.
like? I don't know what that looks like.
Yeah.
I was talking to the braided journeys teacher at our school, and she works with like our First Nations and Métis and Inuit students at our school, and she was like, "Yeah, like I don't know what if we woke up tomorrow and like all of this was dismantled, like I don't know what I would do." And I was like, "Yeah, like
Right. I
so."
know. That's funny you say the limitation thing because that's literally what I posted about just on my Instagram before this was because I would like tell people my visions and then they would be like, well, you can't do that. You can't do that. That's not possible. And then I was like, according to who? According to your own limitations. Like, I'm going to, keep this vision in mind. But then I guess we do have limitations. Like growing up, if you've never seen, quote unquote success, or if you've never seen wealth, then you may not even know that reality exists outside your own reality. Because I also realized I had a privilege in a sense of like growing up as an urban native and not growing up on the res. So yeah, I like how you say, what would it look like without limitations and without having to dismantle everything?
And I think, well, you're like, I kind of glanced through your post, but like my first thought with that too was even like the matriarch thing, like the power of like Indigenous women. Like, it's so funny you're talking about like limitations because like that's a huge thing too. Is like people impose limitations on Indigenous women because we're seen as too loud or too much.
Mm-hmm. Well, even like I think like even when you start taking up space for me, I've realized, I'm like, should I be like I code switch a lot and just like little things that you wouldn't think that you have to do. It's almost like how do you remain in authenticity while also realizing like sometimes it does feel like you are doing things for like the white gaze almost. I don't know if that's a proper way of saying it, but yeah, like for even in the education system, I guess, are you confronted with like having to code switch or, having to dim your own authenticity as an Indigenous woman?
For sure. I always say that there's a game and I'm really bad at playing it because I have a really hard time. Like there's for sure like a political game, and if you look at almost any school board in Alberta, the superintendent, I think every superintendent in Alberta except one is white. Um, the upper leadership teams of most education systems are white and mostly men. Um, and so trying to navigate that, and a lot of principals are men. Uh, and so yeah, trying to navigate that as an outspoken woman and an Indigenous woman is sometimes not well received. And I just like, well, if they don't like me, too bad, because I don't have time to worry about people that aren't invested. Like if the tone of my message is the issue, then you weren't really invested in the message to begin with.
Exactly. And so like what are the tools that you have? For me, it's like when I need to get back to myself, like I have tools as in like meditation and yoga, and I go to the beach and I offer tobacco. So do you have tools that like keeps you rooted in your own power?
I'm really awful at uh, being self-aware of my own levels. It's like crash and burn, and then I'm like, oh, I should probably take better care of myself.
Mm-hmm.
I think the tools for me, whether I'm conscious of them or not, is like the community around me. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm very fortunate that I have a very supportive partner. Um, and sometimes he's more in tune to it than I am. He'll be like, "Do you need me to do anything for you? I'll make dinner tonight." Like or he'll just text like, "Do you need anything? Do you want anything?" Like, my mom is the first person to be like, "Are you sure you have the energy for that? You need to take care of yourself. You need to take better care of yourself. You can't take on everything." And also having friends who have um, those shared values as well that are like, on you and like trying to make sure you're okay. Exercise is huge. I really like, and I know that about myself that if I exercise, I just feel a lot better mentally and emotionally. But that's the first thing to fall off when I'm like feeling overwhelmed. So
Yeah, and like not being too hard on yourself when that does happen. You mentioned your mother, so I'm curious to know, like, who are the matriarchs that you're currently inspired by, and what does the word matriarch mean to you?
I think matriarch means a lot of things. I actually wrote a list because like I'm like, I'm gonna think about like what does matriarch mean to me. So some of the things that I thought of right away were grounding. Um, and that's very much true in my family, that my mom is the grounding force, the roots of the tree that we're all a part of. I think power, um, and I think that that's a tough one for a lot of people, is that women with power. I was talking about this with someone the other day actually, and we were talking about when you grow up with a strong mother, uh, you don't think twice about it. I have three sisters. We all are very outspoken, self-assured women, and I credit that in large part to my mom, but also to my dad because he never tried to dim my mom's light. Like, he was never intimidated by her self-assuredness. And so, yeah, that power, I think, perspective. Um, Women bring a necessary perspective, and I think that's why women in leadership and matriarchs in leadership is so important, because there is a thoughtfulness and an intentionality there that is necessary in decision making. Accountability. I think matriarch is accountable to the people around them. I think we're in a like society right now. There's a lot of people who want power, but not the accountability of that power. And so I think matriarchs embody that in how they move through the world, and the decisions they're making are not just rooted in self.
Seriously. Seriously.
So,
And then matriarchs that you're inspired by right now.
always my mom.
Yeah.
Um, I think you know what? There's so many on social media.
I know.
Matriarchs in the making, because I think that like a lot of us are in the stages where we're making moves in our communities, and it's really interesting, and like it gives me a lot of hope to see like these strong women throughout Turtle Island who are making moves and inspiring communities and inspiring youth, and working to restore that balance. So I don't know. There's too many that I can even name.
I know there's a lot. There's a lot. Yeah, I feel like there's a lot to be hopeful for and to look forward to in the future. Would you have any advice for the younger generation that, maybe wants to do what you're currently doing right now?
I would say go for it. We need more Indigenous teachers. We need more Indigenous educators who are working to dismantle the status quo in education. I would also say be forewarned that not everyone will like you. That's okay. Not everyone will agree with what you are pushing for and advocating for, and that's all right. They don't have to. As long as you know what you are fighting for and who you're fighting for, that's the most valuable thing you can focus on.
Well, thank you so much, Megan, for, sharing your space and sharing your knowledge with me today. Where can people support your work and follow you and to learn a little bit more about you?
On Instagram, I'm at Tipler Teaches. That's pretty much where I predominantly am. I don't really spend a lot of time on other social media sources. I do have a Teachers Pay Teachers store, but it's pretty bare. I'm working to try and get more resources out to support other teachers, but yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Megan. And yes, make sure you follow her work, support her, and I'll tag all the handles below. Hi. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and I'd love your feedback. Follow me on Instagram at Shayla0H, at matriarch.movement, and don't forget to subscribe on the pod platform of your choice and review and rate where possible. I'll be back in a week. Thank you, hi, so much for tuning in.